Welcome to part 2 of the messaging system based on the socket API. Um, I'm continuing on with the actual client interface. This is basically the interface that is displayed when a user selects option 2 from here, which is to send a message. When they press 2, they'll be told that they're going to create a new message, and if they want to send a message to multiple recipients, they can use a comma between the names. So they're displayed with send to, and they type in the names. Just for testing purposes, the names AAA, BBB, CCC, and DDD all exist, but the name ZZZ does not. So when they can enter their message text, which is as it says there, and they'll get told that the message is being sent. And as the name ZZZ does not exist, they get an error message back saying that it failed to reach one recipient, but it will have been sent to everybody else. And once that is done, they'll then be displayed with the main options menu again. So from this menu, this is when client selects option 1, which is display messages. They press number 1, and all the messages held by the server will be sent to them. And this is the message that was sent in the previous slide, sent to these recipients, and Z did not exist, but it still shows that they would have been addressed to in the message. And we can see here it was sent from account DDD, and this is the timestamp, and this is the message. And once all the messages are displayed, they're then brought back to the main menu display again. From a methodology point of view, we can see that first we completed the common classes, which were mainly POJOs, which were in the utils package, and they were the classes that are going to be shared between both client and server. So with those completed, we then kind of worked on an interface, or a prototype interface. I kind of showed the slides there of what the finished interface looked like, as well as the kind of prototype at the start. And from there, we then split up the work into who would work on the client, and the other partner would then work on the server. I worked on the server part, and John worked on the client side. I can just go back here and I'll show you the classes then that were in both of them. As you can see here, then I worked on the client side, which contained my server, a server thread, and a user base. And the client side contained the login class, which was used for taking all the client's information, which would then be sent to the server. So then this is the server user base class. It's basically just a user base of user information. As you can see here, it has just one variable, which is an array list of users, and it is set up at the beginning just to have some sample data in it, just for testing purposes, which can be removed later, but I've left it in just to make things easier. So it contains these 3 users, which will always be set up as default. The user base contains a small amount of methods, which are basically very simple. Just add a user, which will add a new user to the database. And it checks does a username exist, but I don't think that method was actually ever needed to be used. We can check that a user exists and its password matches so that a user can log in, an existing user that is. And then most importantly, we can add a message to a user account. So that's when a message is sent from a client to the server. The message will be put into this method, and this will look through the to list in the message, and it will send the message to each of those recipients that are listed. The My Server class is basically just the only class that gets run on the server. It sets up the user base, which is the database of users, and the server port that clients can connect on. It then tries to set up the server socket using the server port listed above, and it'll give a little print line saying that the server is ready and waiting. And then it sets up the stream socket when a client connects, and the server socket is then passed into the stream socket, and that is basically the connection set up for a client. And that socket is then passed into a new thread, which will set up our multi-threaded program. It also passes in the user base so that the thread has access to the database of users. And then the thread gets started and it loops back up here again, waiting for another client to connect. The server thread, which contains most of the functionality of the program, has several variables, as you can see here. These are ones that coincide with, or the static final variables coincide with the static final variables listed on the client. So this makes it quite easy when programming to determine which number is actually supposed to do which task. And then we just have the stream socket, the user base, and a user is also created so that we can get access to a specific user's data and their messages. A boolean to say that a user is logged in, and one to say that they're connected, so that once they're disconnected we can disconnect their stream. So that's the basic functionality of the server thread. I also have a sequence diagram here, and it just kind of shows how messages are passed between classes from the client to the server. So this part is from a client point of view. When a user, this is the login class, so a user logs in and then we get their input, and this will decide what the user wants to do. So in this case they're going to be entering the number 2 to send a message. So it'll be number 2 to send a message, and this will then initiate the task, which is send a message, and we will then request from the user, because they want to send a message, we'll ask them who they want to send the message to, and that will be inputted as a string. We'll also then ask them for text, which will be inputted as another string. So we'll get these 2 bits of data, along with, as we know which user is logged in, because that data is saved when the user logs in, we can attach that to the from part of the message, so we know who then sent the message. So we create the message object, and as we've put those bits of data in, we can then go send a message as an XML string, which just returns back from the message class. It will return back the XML string of the message, and the timestamp will be added to that during that process as well. So then the message string, or the XML string, is then sent from the login class to the myStreamSocket class, and first, before we send the actual XML string, we send the send message code, which the user inputted up here. We send this to the server so that the server then knows it's to get ready to receive a message, and we then send the message XML string to the myStreamSocket, which then gets sent to the server. And when that is sent, the client will then wait for a response from the server coming from the myStreamSocket. It's waiting for a message to come back, which will be an integer, which will say whether the message was sent to all recipients or not. and then that's basically what happens on the client side when it's sending a message. On the server side, it has to get ready to receive a message. So the MyStream socket, or rather the server thread, is always waiting for a command coming from the client. So the server thread is waiting for a command. It receives it from the MyStream socket, and it receives that it's waiting for the receive message code. So when it receives that, it will then wait to receive a message from, well, the server thread will run a method which will then wait for a message to be received. When it gets the message, it will be in it knows that it will be in an XML format. So it creates an instance of the XML parser class, and it inputs the string to that, which will then return a message object of the parsed XML string. The message object will be passed to the server. The server will then access the user base, and it will access the method. It'll access the user base class, which will then access the method add message to user account, and it will pass the message as a parameter into that. And from that, it can then determine if the message was sent to all the recipients that were listed in the message or not. So it will send back, if it sends back 0, it means that the message was delivered to everyone. If it sends back a different integer, which could be anything above 0, and that's the number of recipients it failed to send to, and it will send that back through the MyStream socket using the send message method, which will then get flushed out to the client. And that was where the client was here waiting to receive the message back from the server. And that is basically how messages are passed between each class and then between the client and server. Testing was performed in a number of ways for this program. I'll show you now. First of all, there was the test package, which basically tests were performed on the POJO classes. As you can see here, there is one for testing add user, and it had a number of tests to check that, and there was one for testing a user login and for testing add message. And we can see here, we can just run this class, and here's the results of the tests. Various ones are run, so you need to read through all those and you can see the results of those. And there was one for the message parser as well, which is quite a small class, as it was just parsing an XML string. And there was the message test, which was quite an important one to test. These are all just to check that the basic functionalities of the POJO classes were working as expected. So they could be tested independently, which served to create the test class. But the client and server classes could not be tested in this way, since they actually need physical connections to work. There was a test performed at the start before multi-threading was created. It was checked to see that the class worked while it was just a single-threaded program, and this is it here. Just the connection was tested when the server class was created. It was tested using an Echo client class just to make sure that the connections did actually work. So that's the test for those, and I can show you now the actual program running fully and the classes used to create it. I will run those in the next